Hello all, and welcome to the MassCann Education Village. Today, we're going to have what I expect will be a very interesting segment. We're going to be speaking with one of the people that has been involved with cannabis law reform in Massachusetts longer than anyone else that I know of, and at a level that was much more national, for instance, than most activists here in Massachusetts, and that is attorney Richard Evans. I'm Bill Downing. I'm a former long-standing officer and director of MassCann NORML, and today I'm interviewing Dick Evans. He's the person most familiar with the pre-MassCann movement for cannabis law reform in Massachusetts. Dick's work on the NORML board of directors started before MassCann's founding in 1989. Dick served on advisory boards for initiative committees that led to decriminalization, medical use, and now legalization. And until very recently, Dick was a cannabis business attorney practicing in Northampton, Massachusetts. Dick, thank you for all your hard work educating the public, enabling sweeping moderation of cannabis laws in Massachusetts.
Thank you, Bill. Thank you, Bill. And thank you especially for all your extraordinary hard work over the years.
Oh, yeah.
When you hear cannabis reform movement in Massachusetts, the word is synonymous with Bill Downing. You have been the guy out front. And,
there you go. I'll take
lots
all
of us
the
appreciate
you.
Thank you for you said something there, Bill, that I'll mention. You said that I've helped educate a lot of people. For many years when we were involved in the movement, we used to talk about the need to educate the public about marijuana. And it was our view that once the public was educated, then they would see the ridiculousness of prohibition and would come around to support our view, and we could legalize. Well, you know as well as anybody, we did a lot of educating. We talked to a lot of Kiwanis clubs, but not that many. I think it was when decrim passed in 2008. I remember Mike Cutler and I left the victory party in Boston, and we're walking across the common, and I had an epiphany, and I realized that all those years, making all those talks and writing those articles and doing all that educating, that's not what the public needed. They knew about marijuana already. What they needed was the opportunity to go into the privacy of a voting booth and express their view about marijuana without anybody condemning them for it. That's what we gave them in 2008, in 12, and in 16, and most especially and significantly, I think it's what a lot of activists, MassCann and drug policy Alliance folks did with the PPQs. The PPQ experience, I think, was extraordinary. There were like, 40 PPQs from 2000 to 2016. Every single one of them passed.
What is a PPQ, Dick?
Good question. Yeah. PPQ is a public policy question, which is voters are familiar with when you see a ballot item that says, shall the representative from this district be instructed to vote in support of a measure that does XYZ. That's a public policy question. It's non-binding, but it's a poll of voter sentiment on a particular issue.
And you're saying we had 40 of these?
Yeah, there's like marijuana related, and MassCann and Drug Policy Alliance folks engineered some 40 odd PPQs from that 16-year period, I think, from 2000 to 2016. And I may not be exactly right in my dates. Every single one of them passed. Every single one of them passed. That was a big story that went ignored by the mainstream media that no one seemed to notice. And when I brought it up to the political experts, they sort of dismissed PPQs. Oh, they're not accurate. I mean, it's the most accurate measure of public sentiments you can get, I think. Well, especially for the dollar, because it costs practically nothing to get on the ballot. So,
yeah, and every one of those people is a voter.
Absolutely, yes.
They're actually voting.
So I think that's so the point of all this is that it wasn't so much educating the public as giving them the opportunity to express what they already knew about cannabis.
I would agree with you in large part. I have a feeling that if legalization had been on the ballot many years earlier, it would have easily passed even then. Um, so perhaps what we were doing was we were educating the public by demonstrating to them that there was a big base of support. I know as a marijuana user for many, many years, I felt very isolated. And I didn't know that there were groups of people who were working for marijuana law reform until, of course, I got involved with MassCann and we met and all that stuff. So that's part of the education process too, is just understanding that we are we're organized, and as a group we have power.
Yes, and but it wasn't until 2012, I think, or 2008 rather, with DCRIM, that we demonstrated that power.
Yeah, I'd agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let me get into some of these questions here. You are an attorney. You've just retired.
Well, we're retired from cannabis, representing cannabis or cannabis establishments. I'm still, I haven't given up my law office where I do property and probate. I was like the only lawyer in the marijuana reform movement who was not a criminal defense lawyer. And but recently, finally, those skills have proved useful. Because I know about property and things like that, contracts. Criminal defense lawyers didn't know anything about property or contracts.
Right.
But zoning. I mean, whoever thought a marijuana lawyer would be involved in zoning issues? And I've been up to my neck in zoning for the last couple of years.
Yeah. Huh.
But I'm just Mike Cutler, my partner, and I. We are just closing our office and retiring from representing cannabis establishments. But I'll be around. You'll see me around.
Oh, I'll look forward to that. Yeah.
Ask another question.
Having been trained as an attorney, I'm sure that instilled in you a certain sense of what is just and what is not just. And I wonder,
indeed, that's what got me into this in the first place.
And I'll bet you of my question. You just look at it.
Oh, I see. Well, you've done a lot of television interviews, as have I, and others of us in the movement. And as you know, one of the first questions they always ask you is, how did you get into this in the first place? And they're trying to get you to say, oh, I love weed. The story I like to tell in answer to that question, which is worked pretty well for 40 years, is that, it was when I was a freshman in law school and studying constitutional law. And I couldn't square what I was reading with what I was seeing, college kids getting busted, black folks being collected up shut down for marijuana stuff. And just didn't square with me. So the more I looked into it, the more I learned about it, the more I realized how grossly unjust the marijuana laws were, and blah, blah, blah. I take it from there. So that's how I always handle that question.
I see. Well, that's a good way to handle it. It is a social justice issue at its core. And that was part of what motivated me to get involved as well.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So before MassCann was formed in '89, of course, I really have no familiarity with what was happening in Massachusetts as far as cannabis law activism goes. Maybe you can kind of paint for us a little bit of the landscape as it stood in the pre-'89 period. Was there organized effort? How did that go?
Well, I can tell you this, that it was around, let's see, I graduated law school in '72 and opened my office in Western Mass in '74. And it was then, like any young lawyer in a small town, I started getting involved, and I found myself on the board of all these nonprofits and perfectly respectable organizations. And then it was about '77 or so, on Saturday afternoon, I was sharing a joint with a colleague, and we were lamenting about how unjust the cannabis law, the marijuana laws were, and here we were, a couple of young lawyers sitting around passing a joint, and yet if we'd been black or if we'd had been outside where somebody caught us, then what would happen. And he said to me, you ought to join NORML. And I'd heard of NORML, but I had not. I knew better than to get anywhere close to NORML, because they're a marijuana organization, and when you can't be associated with marijuana. It was so absolutely taboo in those days. And but I said, what the hell? And so, but very, very cautiously. I mean, I'm a cautious and conservative guy, and some would say too much so. But as it happened, I had a client who was starting a newspaper, a little alternative paper, which actually became very successful. And so I got him to give me press credentials to go to the NORML conference. This is going to be my cover. So if anybody questioned why I was there, that would be my cover story. I'm here to write a story about it. Well, so I go to the NORML conference in Washington, D.C. in 77. I'm pretty sure it was 77. Could have been 76. And I go into this big ballroom at this fancy hotel in Washington, and there's 300, 400, 500 people in this room with this dais up front with all these luminaries, congressmen and mayors, and the writer, what's his name?
Jack Harrer?
Who?
Jack Harrer? Or Lester Grinspoon?
Oh, of course, Lester. I don't know if Lester was there at that one, but anyway, all these real notables and people I've heard of and seen on television a lot, and some great speeches, and then the folks there, they were just the coolest crowd I've ever been in my life, and then they were, well educated, but a diverse group, and a lot of them had really good tans. I remember that. So I think a lot were in the biz, but they didn't let me know that. And then the best part of the NORML conferences was, the parties afterwards, and suddenly I found that there were other people in this world who viewed marijuana like I did. Not only enjoyed its consumption, but and found it really significant to one's life, but also wanted earnestly to do something to change the laws, and suddenly I found myself in this sea of like-minded people, and it was just glorious, just absolutely wonderful. Glorious. So I came back to Massachusetts, energized and galvanized to do something, and I remember that there had been another guy from Boston or Massachusetts at the conference, young guy, I don't remember his name, sorry, but he and I, we got together. We decided that we'd split up Massachusetts, and I would be Western Mass NORML, and he could be Mass NORML or Boston NORML. And I remember we looked at the map and drew the line. And I put a little group together, and I remember I accompanied him to the State House when the legislature was considering a bill. And I don't remember now what the bill was. That was the first time I'd actually gone. And I remember just being appalled that he was there in a t-shirt and jeans and didn't really seem to make any effort. He was the stereotypical role of a stoner, and it really bothered me. But at least I got a glimpse of how the legislative process worked. And then the more I thought about this and realizing that public activism wasn't really going to get us anywhere because to be supportive of marijuana was to be a pariah, to be outside polite society. And when I came out for marijuana reform, probably about late 70s, 79, 80, that's when all those invitations to go on nonprofit boards dried up. which was a good thing, you know. And I never got another invitation to join a board until a few years ago after we won. So it was liberating, I must say. So then they're going back to the 70s, I got the idea that maybe the reason that no one was paying any serious attention to the idea of legalization, though we couldn't even use that word in polite society in those days. We had to talk about reform, you know, euphemisms like that. The notion that we would support a law where adults could go in and buy cannabis for their personal consumption, that was too radical, too radical even to conceive or to mention. So we talked generally about, not generally, but carefully about reform, vaguely about reform. And then reform took the form initially, you know, of decriminalization. And so anyway, but getting back to the late 70s, early 80s is what you asked me about. So it occurred to me that maybe one of the reasons that we were getting no traction whatsoever with the notion of regulation and taxation, what we have now, which was the fancy term for legalization, or at least it is now, not a permanent term, I hope. Perhaps the reason no one really gave that serious thought was that it hadn't been figured out how to do it. No one had ever put a plan together to actually develop a system of regulation and taxation. So I said, well, there's something I can do. I'm out here in Western Mass, So I remember I took a weekend and I brought the statute books home, and I looked at Chapter 138 of the General Laws, which is the Alcohol Beverage Control Act, which was largely passed when marijuana prohibition was repealed in 1933. And while mentioning that, which we can come back to if you want, because it's one of my favorite subjects, back when in my early days, I decided to read everything I could about alcohol, the repeal of alcohol prohibition, which was extremely informative. But the ABC Act, which is on the books now, was enacted in pretty much the form it's in now, fewer than 24 hours before the commerce in alcohol was legalized on December 5th, 1933. That's when the moment in which the 18th Amendment was repealed by the 36th state, Utah. Another whole story there. So back to the late 70s, early 80s, I figured someone needs to show how our system of how marijuana could be legalized, what legal marijuana would look like. So I took Chapter 138, the ABC law, rewrote it for marijuana. You know, where it said alcohol or booze, across that. And I just did a lot of cut and pasting. This was before computers even, and literally cut and pasting, and sort of rewrote this new statute for the Massachusetts general laws, and very parallel to the alcohol laws, and I got somebody to introduce it. I didn't think it would, had any chance of getting.
It was introduced on request.
Stir up some discussion or such. So, actually, the guy that introduced it for me was a Republican state rep named, help me, Andy. He went on to become George Bush the first. No, W's. He went on to become W's chief of staff.
Oh, Andrew Lelling was that?
No, he U.S. attorney. He had the reputation of a young progressive Republican state rep. So I called him up. Thank you, Andy Card. Yes. So he had the courage to now he introduced it by request, with those words at the top. And when a state legislator introduces a bill by request of a constituent, that's a signal to everybody it's not to be taken seriously. But that's all right. I knew that. I wanted to at least get it in the hopper and produce something that would produce, maybe stir up some discussion. So he introduced it, and he later caught a lot of shit for it, I'm sorry to say. But it didn't seem to hurt him. He went on to the White House, in a sense.
But the bill was with the study, I expect.
Oh, but of course it had hearing. Yes, I mean, it had its hearing. And so I got notice of the hearing, and I collected a couple of friends from the Valley here, and we went down to Boston, and the room was packed. It was just filled with all these anti-drug crusader types. Now remember, this is the early 80s. This is when the parents' movement was feeling its oats, and demonizing marijuana, certainly. The parents' movement was a very, very powerful force in the early 80s and dominating the whole scene with regard to marijuana, and certainly smothering all efforts at reform. So I go in the room, big hearing room at the State House. It's packed with all these mad mothers against pot types, with the funny hats and the badges and T-shirts, and I'm, in my coat and tie as usual, and when they realized who I was, I remember the look in their eye. They looked at me like I was the devil. I was the guy that's trying to corrupt their children, and sorry I didn't fit their stereotype, but
oh, you're saying you're not? Oh,
not there. I mean, they were expecting, some drug dealer, some swarthy drug dealer type, I think, and they ended with me. I'm the guy with the necktie and the haircut, so which was my job in the reform movement, basically. But so our bill got called, and the chairman, I stood up and he gave me, my usual 3 minutes, and then he gave someone from the opposition army there 3 minutes, and maybe one or two other speakers, but he was fair. And then he looked at his watch and he said, well, I think we've heard enough on this issue. All in favor say aye. And he's talking to the room, not the committee. I said to myself, oh, good grief, I didn't know this is the way it worked. I thought, but so I and my 2 or 3 friends, we jumped up and said aye. He said, all opposed say no. Well, the building shook. I mean, there was a roar, the likes of which you have not heard. They're still talking about it. And bang with the gavel. And that was it for marijuana reform for about 25 years.
Oh, man. Yeah.
But funny thing was, we got a foothold. We showed it could be done. We demonstrated you could regulate and tax marijuana just like you can alcohol. So I think that accomplished something. So after that, NORML asked me to put together a group to write a regulation taxation bill or a legalization bill, but remember, we couldn't use the word then, on the federal level. So I guess it can be told now, because he's dead, but there were 4 of us that put it together. Myself and Eric Sterling, who's alive and well, that everybody knows. We're good friends.
Criminal Justice Policy Foundation.
Exactly. And but he was a Capitol Hill staffer in those days, so his name wasn't on it, and he couldn't be open about that. If there's anything that all of us marijuana activists over the 40 years that I've observed, if there's anything we have in common, What would you say it is, Bill? What do we all, besides marijuana, what do we all have in common?
I guess love of country.
No, well, yes, but we're all self-employed.
Oh, hey, interesting observation. Yeah.
Yes, because you can't have a job and be for marijuana reform back in the 80s or the 90s or
True.
probably the early yellows.
Well, yeah, or you've skipped
Not
two
until
jobs.
quite recently, and probably
Right.
still today you've got problems.
Yeah.
But it was people to support marijuana reform was really an outlier of his position. NORML, on its envelopes wouldn't even put its name and the return address. Okay. Anyway, so NORML asked me, National NORML asked me to do something like a federal regulation bill. And so Eric and Bob Pisani, remember Bob? Did you ever know him from Philadelphia? He went on. Bob went on. He got out of marijuana, reform movement, but he went on to CNN, and he was the Wall Street reporter. No, for CNBC.
Uh-huh.
He was the Wall Street reporter for CNBC for many years. He was very successful. Great guy, wonderful guy from Philadelphia. And then the infamous Mark Kleiman.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Mark was also, of course, his name couldn't be attached to it officially either. So the four of us met several times, and I remember once in Washington and once around here, and I don't remember where else. I remember this is before the internet. So we developed a very extensive plan, and here it is.
What do you know?
We call it the regulation and taxation of cannabis commerce, but we couldn't put NORML's name on it. It couldn't be officially sponsored by NORML because that would doom it. Because as soon as anybody saw NORML's name, a bunch of freaks, a bunch of stoners, not to be taken seriously. And so we called ourselves the National Task Force on Cannabis Regulation. But we had, and a cool thing was we got an ISB number from the Library of Congress, and we were so proud of that. That really legitimized it. And we had a fairly distinguished, group of co-authors or board of directors or whatever, Let's see, Bob Pisani's name is on here. Howard Becker, who's very notable. He's a sociologist at the University of Chicago.
Uh-huh.
Richard Cowan, you remember Rich Cowan?
Oh, of course. He was the director for a while, yeah.
Yeah, he was Mineral Investments in Fort Worth, Texas, the lawyer in Baltimore. Oh, we have a bishop in New York, a black guy, Walter D. Dennis. I don't know if he's still alive. Don Fiedler, you remember him? He was a lawyer in Omaha. Fred Ford. Oh, another professor at the University of Florida, Irving Goffman, economic professor. A couple of more lawyers, another professor, radio producer, Kevin Zeese. So,
sure, yeah.
A decent group of people.
Yeah.
I can't say that ever got a lot of traction, but it helped us all sort of figure out what the legal path ahead was and how we ought to think about the legal apparatus for going forward for reform. And so I sort of, over the years that I was involved in MassCann, I sort of took it as my job. I mean, we all had our own jobs. You did a great job organizing the freedom rallies and many other things. And I took it as my job, actually two things. One is just to be the guy with the haircut and the necktie when you needed one. And the other was to keep the legal juices flowing. And so I would try to, not during the really dark days of the 80s and 90s, but when it was permissible to see that we introduced some bills, to get some bills out on the legislature, even if we knew they wouldn't go anywhere, at least it would help us figure out who our allies were, who our enemies were, see who had the courage to come out and coalesce behind it, very useful things. So you're asking me about the 80s. And so I told you the story about, that was in 81, about, then a couple of okay, maybe we go like, not much more happened in the 80s during the parents movement, but I remember it may have been late 80s, early in 90s. That's the years you were asking me about. Remember this, that a couple of years had gone by, nothing had happened. And so I pulled out my telephone list and called people I knew, they're all Boston people, and said, and Steve Epstein, of course, was one of the first people I called. And I remember bringing a group of everybody I knew that was on board our team, activists. You may have been there, Epstein, whoever else there was.
Maddie Webster probably was there.
Yeah. Maybe Scott and
Mortimer, yeah.
and Maddie and Jack Hall, the lobbyist. I kind of think he was there. He was like, he's been about 17 years old then, but
maybe
I think Mike Cutler was there. Anyway, but I convened the group. We did it in the conference room at the ACLU. And I said to the group, what can we do? I mean, we're beat on all fronts. We can't get any traction anywhere. What can we do? And someone said, a medical bill. Let's file a medical bill. So remember there was this guy that we knew who had an unusual skin disease. Terrific guy. Do you remember him? Very odd, rare skin disease. And he found that using cannabis gave him great relief. And so inspired by his story, because he'd been busted and was looking at, that's how we met him. He got busted. We decided to write a medical bill. And we did. And actually,
are you thinking of Dave Getchell, who had skin cancer?
Who?
Dave Getchell, Maddie Webster's partner.
No, not him. I can't remember the guy's name. Anyway, excuse me. So we wrote a medical bill, and I wrote the first draft of it. And here's what the bill said. Anyway, I wrote it, and Steve Epstein wrote it, and then we filed it. It was 1 page long. And it said, if you're busted, if you can show a note from the doctor, you can go free.
Right.
More or less.
And there's a name for that, isn't it? It's a preemptive defense or something like that?
Perhaps. I don't know.
It means rather than legalizing marijuana, you're having the charges dropped in case if something. It's providing a defense for something.
An affirmative defense, perhaps.
Affirmative, that is.
Okay, all right. So, yeah, that's exactly what it is, actually. So we introduced it. This is when Bill Well was governor. All right. He came in like 92, I guess. All right. So, believe it or not, I don't remember who filed it. It may have been Byron Rushing, who was always a loyal supporter. It got to the committee, and they actually gave it a serious look. We were shocked. And Mike Cutler had a role, and he went up on the Hill, and he was in the meeting. And I assume maybe it was a directive from the governor saying that he would sign something if they would pass something. I don't know. That's speculation on my part. But believe it or not, the bill actually made it out of committee onto the floor of the House, was passed by the House, was passed by the Senate, and was signed by the governor in the dead of night, of course. Now, the bill, and what's really, really amazing is this was like the only pro-marijuana reform bill that was signed by any governor probably within a 20-year span. Believe it or not, it was just miraculous. Now, the bill as signed by the governor wasn't the same as we drafted it. as signed by the governor, and as I think it may still be on the books, says that if you're busted and you can show that you are a participant in a marijuana research program, then operated by the Department of Public Health, then you can get off. Well, the Department of Public Health never got around to establishing the marijuana research program, so no one ever got the benefit of the statute. But the fact that it was passed by the legislature and signed by the governor, do you remember it, Bill?
Very well.
Okay.
In fact,
but this isn't the end of the story. The story doesn't end
right
there. It gets much better, actually. So fast forward, 3 or 4 years. Bill Clinton is elected president. Okay, so Clinton was elected in 92, wasn't he? So, right, I think.
I guess.
And so this must have happened in like 90, maybe, all right? Clinton's elected president, what does he do?
You mean the first medical marijuana bill was signed by Weld in 1991?
Okay,
yeah,
perfect. So Clinton's elected president in 92. He appoints Bill Weld ambassador to Mexico.
Right.
All right.
Jesse Helms.
So Bill Weld, he resigns the governorship. This is a great story. He resigns the governorship. What's his name? The guy, Cellucci, Paul Cellucci. Everybody loved him. Took over. Weld starts brushing up on his Spanish, starts shaking hands, starts meeting people, and waits for his hearing before the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, which is chaired by Jesse Helms of North Carolina. And he waits and he waits and he waits. Jesse Helms, of course, he was, to the right of Genghis Khan, as people said. And he was a staunch supporter of the drug war, as was nearly every legislator, whether they were liberal or conservative. They were staunch supporters of the drug war. We must not stand by while our children are lost to this scourge, of course, and the scourge of drug abuse. So anyway, Jesse Helms, when last seen on this topic, so this is rumored, I haven't seen it, but it's said that he was seen in the conference room holding a paper up and saying he was not going to give a hearing to anybody who was soft on drugs. All right? End of period. Guess what that was?
That was Weld's nomination to ambassador of Mexico.
No. What was Jesse Helms holding up?
Oh, I'm not sure. What do you think?
Our bill.
Oh, really?
So the story goes.
Yeah, you killed Bill Weld's ambitions.
Now there's a coda here. Yeah, several years ago, I met someone who was close to the Weld family, and I shared that story. And he said, no, he didn't buy it. He said the nomination was had to do with Weld's overzealousness as a federal prosecutor.
Yeah.
So there's another side to all stories, but it's a great story.
It is. It's a good
Okay,
story.
I'm talking too much. I'm sorry. Where are we? You asked me another question.
Well, I just want to back up just a quick while because I'm still curious. Do you recall what years you were on the NORML National Board of Directors?
It was in the 90s, I think, when Lester reformulated the board. It was in the 90s. Yeah.
And you were on for what, I don't know, 4 or 5 years maybe?
Yeah, something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, gotcha.
Yeah.
And I know you've mentioned that NORML asked you to work on this writing language for a bill for legalizing, nationally legalizing marijuana. What do you think was their central focus in the 90s? Was it on legislation? Was it on helping lawyers? Was it, what was their big thing? Was it organizing chapters?
In the 90s, the marijuana reform movement was hanging by a thread, hanging by a thread. NORML was devastated. The year, it was my first or second year as being active in NORML, when NORML basically went down the tubes with the Peter Bourne affair.
Oh boy, yeah.
You familiar with the Peter? It's another story. I've only got 20 minutes left. I can tell you that story.
Well, I can just recap it. He was an assistant for Carter, I think, in some fashion.
He was Carter's drug czar.
Drug czar.
And he came to the NORML party, and I saw him come in the door and go up the room. And it was later revealed that there had been cocaine shared at that party.
And it was supposedly
he was fired. He was out of a job
himself.
And the entire marijuana reform movement is said to have gone up Peter Bourne's nose. And so the criminal defense bar, and give them huge credit, they're really the guys, the criminal defense lawyers kept the movement, to the extent there was one, alive. They're the ones who came together. They're the ones who did the TV interviews. They're the ones who, such as it was, they kept NORML stores open. It was the criminal lawyers, and they've never been given sufficient credit.
No,
So,
particularly because they were destroying a portion of their income.
yeah, but it wasn't about money for them, you know.
No.
They were patriots. They were patriots. Okay, let's go on, Bill. What else do you want to talk about? I can talk about that.
Do you remember when you first came in contact with, and what your impressions were when you came in contact with Marijuana Policy Project or Rob Campia?
Oh, sure. I knew Rob and Rob Campia and Chuck Thomas when they were at NORML, and I remember hanging out with them, and I personally have never had any adverse. I knew them socially and professionally, and was not party at all to the unpleasantness surrounding their split from NORML, and wish them well, and frankly am in awe of what MPP accomplished. Certainly they carried the water for much of the later the modern decrim movement, you could say, and the medical marijuana movement and the legalization movement. You got to give them immense credit for raising the bucks,
right?
And we have them to thank in Massachusetts. I remember it from the very beginning. I got a call from Rob one day. He said, "We're looking at Massachusetts, and we need someone to be a local resident to be the chair of the campaign committee," and so that's how I ended up. I mean, I'm basically the only guy they knew in Massachusetts, and they needed a guy with a necktie, to be the chair.
Decrim in 2008.
No, I'm talking about the legalization in 2016.
Oh, okay. Right.
And then he asked me to put a group of activists together. I remember you came, you were there.
Yeah.
And I rented that room in that office.
That's right. What a great evening.
Yeah. And then we went for a nice dinner after, but that was the beginning of the initiative of legalization. And we were there, we were present at the creation there.
Yeah, we were.
And I'm very proud to have assisted to bring MPP to Massachusetts to do question 4. Now, in your email, you mentioned the MassCann initiative, and I've got a lot of thoughts about that.
Oh, okay.
Clearly, the MassCann initiative was MassCann's proposal for a voter initiative in 2006.
The Bay State repeal.
Sorry?
Bay State repeal.
I'm sorry, you're right. Bay State repeal. But it was written largely by Steve Epstein and supported by MassCann, and did not gain sufficient voter signatures, so it didn't make it to the ballot. It it was pretty close to a tomato model, very close to a pure agricultural model. And frankly, I loved it. If you'd asked me in a heartbeat, I would have said, yes, that's the way to go. But, and this is really, really important. When the team that ended up writing question 4, and you were on that team as well, Bill.
Yes, sir.
When we convened, we recalled what happened in California in 2010. They had a voter initiative in 2010 that was pretty loosey-goosey and had a lot of loopholes in it, had a lot of opportunities for abuse, did not have the kind of control measures that we thought would be necessary. And obviously the voters apparently thought the same thing. That's what all the polls said. And it went down it got nowhere close. It went down in trash. I can't remember what it got. Failure. So
I also want to point out that 2010 is a non-presidential election, and you usually have much lower voter turnout, and that's not good for marijuana law reform in general.
Yes, yeah, good point. But anyway, we wanted to avoid those problems. We wanted to present a law, a regulation taxation law, or a legalization law to the voters of Massachusetts that controlled it. And we were constantly making the case that regulation and taxation provided a much better measure of control than any other, and certainly than prohibition. And so control. Looking back today, I think it's one of the biggest mistakes we made, but we'll get back to that in a minute. So the Bay State repeal model, in my view, if I were the king of the world, I would adopt that in a second. I think one of the biggest mistakes we have today with legalization in Massachusetts is there are too many rules. And you asked me, and the question is, what could be done to make this industry open to more people and fewer wealthy people? Because today you got to have big bucks even to get into the business at any level. And I'm not proud of that fact. And the reason for that is there are too many rules, 150 pages of regulations and licenses, blah, blah, blah. Why are there so many rules? Because, I should say, why did the regulators write so many rules? It's because they could. And they could because we, the framers of the initiative, gave them the authority to do so. We did so for political reasons, not for policy reasons, not because we thought all these rules were necessary to protect the public health and safety. And in fact, I'm sure you share my view, and we all do, that the best kept secret about marijuana is its utter benignity, that it does not and will not pose any sort of threat to public health or public safety. But that's never anything we could say in public until now.
You're saying it.
And I think as other states come online, I hope they don't look to Massachusetts as a model. We should not be seen as a model of how to regulate and tax marijuana. I would love to see them adopt the Bay State repeal measure as a model. And that's where ultimately it will go, in my opinion. You'll see some state, look what's happened in Oklahoma, Bill. Oklahoma passed a medical marijuana. Who would have thought Oklahoma passed a medical marijuana bill a couple of years ago? The application is like 3 pages long. There are hundreds of stores open. They were open within months of the law passing. There've been, there haven't been carnage on the highways. The sky hasn't fallen out there. Oklahoma.
Yeah.
Can you believe it?
Well, I don't think Oklahoma would have happened if Massachusetts hadn't happened.
Yes, you're absolutely right. But next, what I anticipate, you'll see a state like Alabama. Alabama passes an adult use law that's just as loose and as easy to get into the biz as Oklahoma's medical law. I could write such a law, in a heartbeat. And then suddenly, Alabama, everybody's going to go to Alabama to grow weed. Because it's so easy to. You get a license in a heartbeat. And then as soon as the feds open interstate commerce, the folks that are growing in warehouses, the folks that spent millions and millions of dollars to open their doors in Massachusetts, what's it going to do to the market? I don't know. I can only expect prices will come way down.
And of course, many countries now, Germany and Canada and a few others, are allowing international trade of medicinal cannabis.
Medicinal.
Yeah.
Good. Okay.
So things are moving rapidly forward. The pace of change is truly amazing. It's like a snowball rolling down a hill where it's gaining momentum and gaining size as it moves along. You know, you hear a study coming out that says, oh, we just discovered that marijuana causes children to become psychotic. And you know that, of course, these studies have been coming out like that for decades and decades, and eventually someone peer reviews it and says, well, that's just a bunch of hooey. And you'd think that would slow things down, or that, you know, for instance, presidential politics would slow things down. But it seems as though the train is rolling very quickly down the track. And no matter what you park in front of it on that track, it's going to just ram right through it. And that's the way I see marijuana law reform right now. Are you kind of on the same track? This is an unstoppable train.
Yeah, I think so. But I hope that the laws will become more and more like the Bay State repeal, like the tomato model. Because frankly, there's only two reasons, in my view, to regulate and tax marijuana, other than political reasons. There's only two policy reasons. And one of them is to keep it out of the hands of children. And the other one is to protect the revenue. Period.
Right. And I have a feeling that there are tendencies with these kinds of laws. So you're an expert on the repeal of alcohol prohibition. And one of the things that happened is a lot of towns passed prohibitions on the sale of alcohol. And for a long time, those laws stood. And there were dry towns in Massachusetts.
That's right.
But I think the last one was Rockport. And I think Rockport is no longer a dry town.
Oh, I think there's some dry towns.
Are there?
Out here. I think there are out here. Yeah.
Okay.
But some towns that don't have a population.
That at one point, there were a lot of dry towns. Yeah. And now we're trying to think if there are any left.
Good question. I suspect there are. But there were dry states until Utah was the last state. But what's really fascinating is that it was Utah that was the 36th state to ratify the 21st Amendment, which repealed the 18th. And it was Utah that legalized alcohol, but they stayed dry for many, many years.
But my point being that that attitudes toward cannabis are going to continue to evolve, and police attitudes toward cannabis are going to continue to evolve as well. And I expect that if police find you're growing too many cannabis plants, rather than hauling you off to jail, obviously they can't. They'd fine you. They'd give you all kinds of trouble. A lot of times now, I think the police are going to be just saying things like, yeah, just get rid of these extra plants and you're all set.
Yeah, I agree with you, Bill, but I would add to that, instead of saying attitudes are evolving, I would say public attitudes are evolving. People are willing to talk about marijuana in public that they would not have done so in the past. You know, I've had a lot of discussions recently with like local public officials, select board members, zoning board members. And the fact that some of these people will just talk about marijuana like it was another crop, like it should be talked about, because it is, it's just remarkable. It's just astounding. So there's a new honesty. There's a new honesty. People are willing to admit, finally, for the first time, that they're not only talking about their own consumption, but also that they're fairly knowledgeable about it.
Well,
that's what we're seeing.
Yeah.
The green closet door is opening.
Well, we started this off by saying that one of your biggest motivators for getting involved in cannabis law reform was the social justice issue.
Absolutely.
And it's kind of been kicking and screaming as we threw it out the door. But things, for instance, like police stops that involve searches because of the smell of marijuana have been gotten rid of. A lot of the things that were used as tools of institutionalized racism have been taken away from the police, and I think that was one of our major goals.
Yes, yes. In all the years, all my years of advocacy, I never made a speech without talking about the origins of prohibition. Typically, I would ask the audience, "Why is marijuana illegal?" Someone would talk about, paper making or something. And the answer is racism, that marijuana prohibition was conceived and implemented and enforced shamefully for the purpose of providing an instrument of oppression against minorities. And that was my principal driving motivation. And I think we all shared that, I think.
Oh, yeah.
And
of course, marijuana is not unique in that fashion. The opiates were targeted against the Asian populations in the United States, just like Mexicans were targeted with marijuana. Mexicans and blacks and people like that.
Right. And we Massachusetts can take a lot of pride, I think, in the fact that our law, question 4, contained those 35 words, that mandated or required the CCC to adopt regulations to provide opportunities for people from communities disproportionately impacted by the drug war. And we were lucky to get that through, frankly, that didn't get tossed out by the SJC. I and everybody else has been disappointed, frankly, that those opportunities for minorities have not materialized like we hoped they would. And while I continue to fully support and embrace the idea of opening the doors to participation by minorities, people disproportionately impacted, I have to wonder if door opening is the only way to try to address this historic injustice of prohibition. And maybe there are other ways to do it. And taming the police, for example, with body cams. Discussion for another day.
Yeah, and just the proliferation of video in general. I mean, how many examples do we need? There are still busts going on for marijuana, and even here in Massachusetts, of course, if you're distributing cannabis or have larger than personal use quantities, and those busts, in large part, are of Blacks and Hispanics. So though we congratulate ourselves and pat ourselves on the back for having toned down the war on marijuana, unfortunately, its use as the remaining laws are still being used as a form of institutionalized racism.
Indeed, and let me make one more point if I can, and that is the damage that marijuana prohibition has done to the law itself and to our liberties themselves. If you look at all the cases, the Supreme Court cases, let's say over the last 30 years, that have narrowed the rights of citizens under the Fourth Amendment, the right to be free from unreasonable search and seizures, most of them are drug cases. Most of the drug cases are marijuana cases. Because, they smell marijuana through the door in the cart or the apartment building or every case, and all of these cases were decided during the anti-marijuana hysteria of the 80s and the 90s. And when it was politically impossible for anyone to support reform, it was not possible, to indicate, to openly support marijuana law reform those days if you tried to be a respectable person.
Well, unless you had nuts made out of iron, like you, Mr. Evans.
We're self-employed. That was the deal. I should say it was impossible for anybody who wasn't self-employed.
There you go.
But the point is that our rights
And also,
were
I'd
permanently
add something
narrowed.
else to that, Dick. You can't have kids in the school system either.
Good point. Exactly. But the point is that the hysteria against marijuana supported all of these court decisions that narrowed the rights of citizens to be free from unreasonable search and seizure. And when marijuana is perfectly legal, when we adopt the tomato model, those laws, unfortunately, will still be on the books. And our rights will be permanently narrowed because of marijuana prohibition.
Well, Dick, it's 11 o'clock, our hour, unfortunately, has been expended. I thought this was a fantastic opportunity to talk, and I loved doing it. I hope you enjoyed yourself as well.
I did indeed. Thank you.
And thank you once again, not only for agreeing to speak with us, but for all your wonderful work. We here at MassCann and those who represent the MassCann Education Village love you.
Well, it's mutual. You can be sure it's mutual. And Bill, you are the guy. No one has done more than you to help us come this far in Massachusetts, and I thank you. And I hope that MassCann, and I thank you, Bill, on behalf of the 1,769,328 voters who said yes on question 4 in 2016.
Excellent number. All right, so long.
Thank you. All right, thank you, Greg.